Guess I always knew this day was coming. Knew that soon you'd want to leave the nest. Soon, but not yet. Shh, trust me, pet. Mother knows best.
Hey YouTube, time for a change of pace. Something I thought I'd try out is reviewing actual feminist nonfiction books, reference texts. In particular, one that was recommended, or at least cited and implied to be recommended, by Anita Sarkeesian. Pornland: How Porn Has Hijacked Our Sexuality by Gail Dines. Published in 2010, it is a condemnation of the pornography industry through touring its most odious trends. Its central thesis is that porn, mostly modern porn, is bad for abusing female sex workers, reinforcing patriarchal values in men who consume it, causing men to have incorrect expectations for sex, causing sexual dysfunction, reinforcing racism, and leading men to commit rape of women and children. I kind of hate this book, but ultimately agree with it in broad strokes. However, the book is also conservative, manipulative, paternalistic, reductive, anti-kink, anti-sex. Written by a terf. It's just... it's manipulative crap. But generally makes some good points about patriarchal pornography, contributing to cultural misogyny through mass repetition of sexist themes in readily consumable content. Do I recommend it? Hell no. Gail Dines is one of the big second-wave feminists and a professor of sociology and women's studies who taught in England, Israel, and currently in the US at Wheelock College in Boston, Massachusetts. She is a terf, transgender exclusionary radical feminist, who is a member of a Facebook group called Women-Born Women Radical Feminist Warriors. Women with a Y is a radfem word to strike out the connection to men, while women-born women is a dated radfem term meaning cisgender women. This group's 8th rule specifies that support of trans people is strictly forbidden, and that trans women must be referred to as men.
So in mainstream third wave feminism, there is an individualistic view that celebrates free choice, agency, and empowerment. What happened when we moved from radical to liberal and then neoliberal is sex as a material reality cemented in and reproduced by patriarchal institutions of equality, which is the radical feminist view, turned to gender as an identity that is fluid and unhinged from patriarchal institutions that reproduce inequality. So we moved from a structural understanding of power cemented into institutions to gender. You can identify in or out of it. You choose what you're going to be. As Eddie Izzard said, he was in girl mode that day, right? Next day, maybe he's in boy mode. I don't know what he is.
However, the bulk of her activism is centered on targeting porn. Before 2010's Pornland, she wrote 1997's Pornography, The Production and Consumption of Inequality, co-founded a group called Stop Porn Culture, regularly lectures on the evils of porn, and has a downloadable toolkit for parents to talk to their kids about porn. Yeah, that sounds like a fun time. Pornland is a hard read, not because it's super technical, but because it's like a horror story, throwing shocking content at you almost constantly in a barrage of nastiness. It's like Gail's She-Wolf of the GC. It's designed to hurt you, so it can manipulate you into supporting what Dines thinks. You're horrified, you look for stability, and you land on her rhetoric, compelling you to condemn porn that you then internalize as the voice of reason in a scary world. All books trying to make a point are fundamentally manipulative, using rhetoric to sell a point, but Pornland is mean about it, in a way similar to a conservative Christian screaming about hellfire. It is essentially a feminist chick tract. Yes, she's Jewish, but she uses the same playbook. The whole thing has a condescending paternalistic tone, dismissing people who don't think like her and didactically informing what they should think. This leads her to dismiss sex workers, women who choose to perform in Girls Gone Wild, and sexual activities she doesn't personally like, to assert a mother knows best framework. It's actually similar to the song from Tangled, utterly dismissing the girl's agency and building up the mother as a caring figure, while she vampirically drains her daughter's emotional strength. Go watch the scene on YouTube to see what I mean, or check out my girlfriend's rendition.
Ruffians, thugs, poison ivy, quicksand, cannibals and snakes, the plague, yes, also large bugs, men with pointy teeth, and stop no more, you'll just upset me. Mother's right here, mother will protect you, darling, here's what I suggest. Skip the drama, stay with mama, mother knows best.
Dines acts like she cares about women in porn, but is ultimately condescending in her treatment of them. She doesn't talk to any of them. Not a single one of the people the book is supposedly based around trying to protect. She did extensive research and conducted many interviews of men who consume porn and actual child rapists, but seemingly took no steps to give a voice to the women she claims are being oppressed. Instead, she read published interviews with Jenna Jameson, no one else, just her, and analyzed them to conclude that Jameson was lying about liking performing in porn and telling the truth about being initially hesitant. Dines urges the reader to imagine Jameson consistently as a teen girl pressured into porn, and not as an adult woman with experience and agency to decide how she wants to live now, tying it into a general save the children message. What's interesting is that Dines demonstrates that she does understand the concept of that interpretive bias when applied to an ideological opponent. At one point, she criticizes a man consuming a porn video in which a woman does something Dines finds degrading. Let's just say drinking a row of shot glasses that do not contain alcohol. The man speculates that the performer's face signaling disgust during the video is acting, but that her final happy look is authentic. Dines counters that the man's bias in favor of porn keeps him from seeing what she thinks is the truth, that the woman betrayed her true feelings of disgust in the middle of the act, and then was able to turn her acting back on at the end. Dines doesn't consider that the opposite might just as likely be true. Her anti-porn bias keeps her from seeing that the woman is acting in the middle of the video to add spice, but is authentically happy at the end. Or maybe both instances are acting. The woman is truly neutral on the subject. Or, for a more nuanced take, maybe both instances are authentic, because workers feeling satisfied after a hard job applies to sex workers as much as anything else. One of the foundational problems with the book is that Dines assumes that all women like sex the way that she likes sex. She grew up in an Orthodox Jewish community, and her sexual preferences are straight-laced. A man and a woman who love each other and express their love through sexual intimacy, probably in the missionary position. That's what makes sense to her, and seems like the obvious way that sex ought to be done in every circumstance, for every person. At one point, she describes a simple practicality of women performing oral sex on men as grotesque misogyny, implying that she has zero personal experience and not much empathy for the women who do so. She accepts gay and lesbian legitimacy, if not trans, and just translates her sexual preferences to the same-sex pairing without any appreciation for queering sexual performance. This underlying assumption is so strong for her that she barely even references it as a subject in itself. Inevitably, some men call her anti-sex, and she says no, she loves sex. She's just anti-porn. But the problem is that her conception of sex is so limited that she can't see other sexual preferences as legitimate, and assumes they're the result of porn consumption. She may not be anti-sex per se, but she's a conservative trying to limit sexual expression. Like many radfems, she refuses to use the label of sex work, to delegitimize and single it out as a form of abuse that can be outlawed. However, the label of sex work is generally desired by the people actually doing it, viewing it as an equally reasonable option in a capitalistic society as anything else. Many sex workers are also leftists who see the word work as a rallying cry to improve conditions for workers across the board, want union protections, etc. Dines teeters on the precipice of recognizing sex work as work, with all the indignities and workplace injuries of any working-class job in America, but stops short and only holds up these downsides as evidence that sex workers are lying about actually wanting to do sex work. The truth is that all working-class jobs are degrading and prone to injury, but some are worse than others. Plenty of sex workers prefer sex work over waiting tables, or working at an Amazon warehouse. I know this for a fact because I actually care about sex workers and see them as people. Some of my friends are sex workers. I follow a lot of sex workers on Twitter and Tumblr. I view it as a legitimate career with potential of psychological fulfillment. And I'm pretty sure every trans person has considered making an OnlyFans. Dines doesn't respect sex workers as actual people capable of choosing their own way in life. She just imagines them as helpless children who need to be protected from evil capitalists, instead of targeting working conditions in general. Here's a truth bomb that Dines appears completely ignorant of. Women can be horny. Dines does not seem to understand this at all. She says that she loves sex, but only in the context of a relationship. So maybe she's asexual or demisexual and thinks that's just normal sexuality because of her conservative upbringing. She only discusses masturbation in the context of men and boys, apparently dismissing female masturbation as a thing outside of cases of child abuse, and only talks about women using porn in the context of men showing it to their girlfriends. She seemingly has no conception of female sexual desires outside of a committed relationship in which the man initiates. Yeah, just think about that for a second. She's a feminist talking about sex with no understanding that women can have sexual desires and look for sexual fulfillment without being prompted into it. From this standpoint, of course, the only reason why women would go into porn would be men's manipulation. Of course, women would not participate in kinks without capitalism driving the development of more and more niches for profit. Women wouldn't even have kinks. Of course, women who say they like sex work would be lying. It all makes sense if you assume that your personal sexual preferences match up with conservative ideology because that's just the way people are with no diversity. This whole thing actually reminds me of Ben Shapiro and his wife not understanding that WAP is about female arousal.
Whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house. My first concern is that these women are describing a serious gynecological condition. Fortunately, I know a doctor, who is my wife. So first of all, she had to clarify whether wet-ass P word was a description of the P word or whether one of the clinical symptoms here was also diarrhea. Hop on top, I want to ride, I do a Kegel while it's inside. So there's some signs of some actual clinical prolapse, which is a problem. There's a line here about gagging and choking, which suggests that perhaps there's an odor issue here. My wife's medical advice is that they go to a gynecologist ASAP and that they do whatever checks are necessary for bacterial vaginosis, yeast infection, or trichomonas.
Yeah, that's what Dines sounds like. You know, as a feminist. There's a part in the book where she takes on Girls Gone Wild and speculates on why women would take part in it that illustrates this bias. She focuses on the fact that women aren't paid to flash their breasts or make out with their female friends on camera, marveling at the small material reward, a cap and shirt, being offered. She's basically aware that women do strange things when money's on the table, but she just can't wrap her head around a woman doing a public sexual performance for free. The concept that women can be horny, flirty, and into doing something outrageous just totally eludes her. She lands on the fact that most Girls Gone Wild participants are in the late stages of adolescence. When I reached this part, I actually nodded and said aloud, and they're horny as hell. However, she continues to say that this means they're vulnerable to cultural messaging. The obvious explanation that teenagers are horny little monkeys looking for the slightest excuse to get off never comes up. Instead of descriptions of teenage hormones, we get descriptions of capitalism and peer pressure. Teenagers are not seen as sexual agents who must be empowered to express sexuality in healthy ways, just girls who can be manipulated by evil men. When discussing the negative impact of Girls Gone Wild, she describes how horrible it is for young women to be branded as sluts, but then blames the people who encourage them to be sexual, not the culture that hates female sexuality. Presumably, any woman who asserts that she has a high sex drive would be disbelieved and silenced, so Dines can go after the closest man she can blame for making women think that they're as sexual as men. To reiterate, this radical feminist sounds like Ben Shapiro.
There's some whores in this house. There's some whores in this house.
With no understanding that women can be kinky, Dines looks at spanking videos and calls them violence against women. She does no research into masochism and the way that women can get off from pain in certain circumstances, dismissing it all as acting and exploitation. She then talks about porn promoting violence against women and the idea of women liking being abused. She polls men who consume porn, asking them how they interpret the concept of women being into it, and prints it in the book in reductive terms, asserting that men think women enjoy being raped. It is manipulative, trashy nonsense. Where it really gets insulting is when she tries to pin child rape on mainstream pornography. Child rapists have two variations. Pedophiles, whose sexual desires revolve around children, thought to be the result of a brain malformation where their parental instincts get linked with their sex drives, and crimes of opportunity, where an adult in a position of power abuses a child because they're available, but would otherwise be attracted to someone their own age. However, Dines doesn't believe mainstream research about why people commit child rape, and instead backs a fringe radfem theory holding that pedophiles are created by ordinary men viewing child sexual abuse materials, CSAM, aka child pornography, with mainstream porn as the gateway drug. That's like saying people are compelled to chum the waters when sharks are likely to show up. They have the causal link totally backwards. Motivated by this ideological reversal, Dines interviewed convicted child rapists about their porn use. Obviously, they consumed porn like most men. Consenting adults weren't doing it for them, so they moved on to CSAM. Using data corrupted by sampling bias of specifically interviewing child rapists, she then asserts evidence for the radfem belief that porn use turns ordinary men into child rapists. She ignores the mountain of contradicting evidence with men who consume porn and don't rape children. You know, the vast majority. To assert this pet theory. In one anecdote, she describes a child rapist who credited the public acceptance of eroticism as a grooming aid. He pointed at women wearing skimpy outfits in music videos and led his victim to want to explore sexuality like they did. This is just insulting. These people will take advantage of every culture to manipulate their victims. In a conservative, prudish context, grooming is based around duty to one's social superiors. In libertarianism, they exaggerate the sexual agency of the child and ignore the responsibility of the adults. In feminism, everyone else is indicated to be abusive, and the rapist acts as the sole good person. Feminist condemnations of grooming can themselves be used as a grooming aid. The blame should be on the rapists alone, not whatever cultural milieu they happen to latch onto. It never even occurs to Dines that this practiced manipulator, understanding her thesis, offered something that would appeal to her to downplay his own culpability in the act. With this crappy data in hand, having limited understanding of teenagers being sexual beings, she examines mainstream porn centered on teenagers and conflates the subject with CSAM. About that term, victims of child abuse and advocacy groups who believe porn is fundamentally legitimate tend not to like the term child pornography, to draw a distinct divide between legitimate porn and footage of child abuse used for sexual gratification of pedophiles, preferring child sexual abuse material. Mainstream advocacy groups do not care about porn that in some way superficially resembles CSAM, as long as no actual children are hurt. However, Dines sees no clear distinction between CSAM and a porn video with an 18-year-old wearing signifiers of youth. She weaves back and forth between discussions of pedophiles trading CSAM amongst each other, men consuming porn featuring consenting teenagers, adults having sex in ways that Dines associates with child rape, including something as banal as manually spreading an orifice before penetration, and literal child rape like it's all the same subject. It's not. This conflation is a tangled mess of harmful nonsense. Oh, and this totally inspired an Anita Sarkeesian Feminist Frequency video, by the way.
The latest issue of GQ has some highly sexualized photos of select members of the Glee cast. It's crossing the line into simulating pornographic pedophilia. This photo shoot is specifically representing fictional TV characters in a high school setting. Many people do not criticize sexualized images of women in the media being debased and dehumanized because they fear being slapped with the totally useless and ambiguous term anti-sex.
Santana Lopez been over on hers the other day, and I swear I could see her ovaries.
God bless the perv that invented these.
Did you know that most studies have demonstrated that celibacy doesn't work in high schools? Our hormones are driving us too crazy to abstain. The only way to deal with teen sexuality is to be prepared. Girls want sex just as much as guys do.
The way Dines talks about something that she saw two consenting adults do, and then compares it to well-researched studies of child rape, like that means anything, is stupid, manipulative, and just weird. It actually reminds me of a joke in Dexter, where Masuka is upset over federal agents taking over his workstation, and instead of focusing on that legitimate emotional response, he tries to find evidence that the feds are actually evil.
Who wears a wool suit in the middle of summer? In Miami. Nazis, that's who. That's exactly how Hitler walked.
That's what Dines is doing. Her fatal flaw is not having a clear understanding of porn's theatrical nature, as is tied with her not really understanding women can be horny outside of the bedroom. For the sake of escapism, porn presents scenarios that shouldn't happen in reality. People can get off on power fantasies without ever expressing them in the real world. The idea of abuse can be sexy in a fantasy context for both the top and bottom. It dispenses with cultural expectations of prudishness and eliminates shame. People who have been abused can eroticize traits related to their abuse due to the misattribution of arousal, a psychological effect where the body tenses in the same way for fear as in sex, and the mind then conflates the two, and they can find it therapeutic to act out scenes of abuse in a safe environment. Teens tend to be sexual beings who get randomly horny, develop kinks, and want to explore them. Adults who are sexual as teenagers retain sexual fantasies from their youth and want to see them played out with consenting adult actors pretending to be younger teenagers. Remember that 18-year-olds are technically adults, even as they're teenagers. A feminist critic who wants to analyze porn trends and highlight problems must have a clear understanding of this before they attempt their analysis. She does attempt to address the criticism that it's all just a fantasy, but does so in a reductive way that has me suspecting that she doesn't fully understand. She says we would object if abusive pornographic scenarios were on mainstream TV. Okay, but we're not talking about mainstream TV. We're talking about consenting adults enjoying something in private. She says we would object if, instead of porn of men abusing women, mainstream media depicted Nazis abusing Jews. Again, we're not talking about mainstream media. And she's apparently unaware of the fact that Nazi porn is a whole thing, largely developed by the Jewish community, because of the way that people eroticize drama and use porn therapeutically. I reviewed one of the most profitable sexy Nazi movies, Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, which was actually produced by a Jewish guy. That inspired a whole mainstream archetype because Steven Spielberg, noted Jewish guy, ripped off Ilsa for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I think the basic concept is fundamentally legitimate as long as there's the right framing, like in The Boys with Stormfront, a sexy Nazi, largely depicted by Jewish creatives. She adds that we would object to mainstream media depicting white people abusing black people. Again, we're not talking about mainstream media. And race play is a whole thing in porn? She talks a bit about racism in porn, but only covers common tropes, like black men's portrayal of exaggerated masculine dominance, not the kind deliberately playing out scenes of racism. There are certainly reasons why black people can get off on that, stimulating something they have a lot of tension built up about. There is, in fact, a whole academic book dedicated to exploring it. The Color of Kink by Ariane Cruz. An equivalent of mainstream Ilsa, in her Nazi incarnation, for black people, might be hard R material that represents some kind of kinky fantasy, like True Blood depicting Tara being dominated by a white woman, and then getting to dominate a racist white woman herself. It's all complicated, with many degrees of nuance that must be considered. However, Dines can't understand why anyone would be into porn at all, so she can't reasonably talk about it with any degree of accuracy. Here's what I agree with. Mainstream porn has problematic trends recreating cultural oppressions. The patriarchal scenarios in which men degrade women are reflective of our patriarchal society and likely contribute back into it. The racism likewise pulls from cultural racism and reinforces racist tropes. The Lolita thing is worth concern, but I'm not sure how much. The popular framing of abusive scenarios with full immersion, assuming that the viewers all understand that it's escapist entertainment, does confuse some people and leads to real-world abuse. Porn is worth analyzing because it's part of the same culture as TV shows and movies, and they contribute back to each other. Sure, I'm totally on board there. However, Dines does not have the eye for nuance to properly engage with the subject. She has no appreciation for women's ability to consent and dismisses the porn that does emphasize enthusiastic consent as just the women lying because she can't envision a scenario in which women would actually be into it. Despite the sharp-heeled boot on the cover, she never even touches on the subject of femdoms, or women acting out abusive scenarios upon consenting masochistic men. There's room to criticize these scenarios as men topping from the bottom, but she doesn't even get there. Likewise, when she talks about racism, she never talks about porn that flips the script and has black people dominating white people. Again, there's room to criticize the fetishization, but she doesn't even get there. Either she's not aware of it, which means that her research didn't get very far, or it means that she's ignoring evidence because it doesn't fit her narrative. Actually, let's talk about that cover art. BDSM is only referenced once or twice under the term S&M, which was outdated even when the book came out, and only in the context of men acquiring new fetishes from porn with which to abuse women. Femdoms never come up, and neither do shoe or outfit fetishes. The cover has nothing to do with the actual content. So, the publisher had to have been going for using sex to sell the work. It looks spicy, so it attracts people's attention. It appeals to people's sexual interests and presents something that stimulates them sexually, if only through very slight softcore imagery. That means that the anti-porn book is itself an instance of porn. That is a beautiful irony. On the whole, I hate this book. It pisses me off. Gail Dines pisses me off. Anita Sarkeesian pisses me off for recommending it. This book is disturbing paternalistic trash. Dishonor on you, dishonor on your cow. Go read The Color of Kink instead.
Don't forget it, you'll regret it, Mother.